So yeah, today we're starting with chapter 10, which is looking at sleep disturbances. So yeah, basically what we'll be doing today is we will be trying to understand what is a sleep disturbance, what's the difference between a sleep disturbance and a sleep disorder. And we're going to just look at a few examples of sleep disturbances that people generally experience. Now in this chapter, there is quite a lot of content that has been taken out. Because Vika have obviously adjusted it for the coronavirus, the whole situation. So you might realize that some of the topics are missing from this slide that are actually in your textbook. Okay, just to let you know in advance, the specific topics that are not covered in this PowerPoint, which have been removed, are dysomnias and parasomnia. So we're not learning about insomnia and we're not learning about sleepwalking. Okay, so those are the two that have been removed. And in conjunction to that also, your cognitive behavioral therapy has been removed, okay, as an intervention. So we're not learning about that sleep therapy as well. But yeah, it's less for you to learn, but if you are going through those extra topics just for your own interest and you have any questions, you can always ask me anyway. Okay, so the first thing we're doing is basically looking at what is a sleep disturbance. So the name of this chapter is Sleep Disturbances, so we need to know how to define that. Okay, so sleep disturbance is basically any kind of sleep-related issue, okay? And the main kind of idea is in the word itself. When we say disturbance, a disturbance is something that disrupts your sleep, okay? It doesn't just disrupt your sleep, it actually disrupts your sleep-wake cycle. So what that means is that a person will either have, they'll either have problems with falling asleep, they might have problems with waking up, they might have abnormal sleep behaviors. So for example, they toss and turn a lot when they go to bed. They can't like sleep properly, or they sleep walk, or they sleep talk a lot, or they grind their teeth while they sleep. Okay, so all of these are like things that could actually, snoring is another example of a sleep disturbance. All of these things, not all of them we're going to learn in this chapter, but they are general sleep disturbances that all of us are quite familiar with. So just remember, a sleep disturbance is any kind of sleep-related issue. It could be a behavior, it could be an experience that you go through once you fall asleep that basically leads to issues with you falling asleep, which we call a sleep onset, waking up, or any kind of abnormal sleep behavior that you experience. That does obviously mess up with the quality of your sleep. So that's what you need to remember in terms of this. And it's very important that you understand what is meant by the sleep-wake cycle as well. Alrighty, so what is the difference now? So obviously we've looked at sleep disturbances, but we've also got something called sleep disorders. And sleep disorders are something that basically, interrupt your sleep or disrupt your sleep to a much greater extent than a sleep disturbance. A sleep disturbance might be something like, for example, sleep talking. It's something that obviously interferes with the quality of your sleep, but it doesn't actually, it doesn't cause you to not be able to go to work the next day. It doesn't cause you to have your, SAC performance affected because you haven't had enough sleep every day. So sleep disorders are a little bit more intense in nature, and they affect your functioning. In the same way that a mental disorder affects your general functioning, sleep disorders also affect your normal functioning as well. So when we look at sleep disorders, there are two main types of sleep disorders. The first one is the primary sleep disorder. The primary sleep disorder is basically, it's when your sleep disorder is due to the actual condition, okay? It's an actual sleep-related condition. So the most common one that most of you would have heard of is insomnia. Okay, sleep onset insomnia, or simply put, insomnia is an actual sleep disorder. If you tell someone that I've got insomnia, it's because that's actually affected your sleep-wake cycle. A secondary sleep disorder is a sleep disorder that doesn't actually, it doesn't start off as an actual sleep issue. It's because of some other issue that you've got in your life. For example, you're staying awake because you have migraines, or you're really stressed from school, or you had a fight with your friend and that's keeping you up at night, or you're overthinking. So these are not, secondary sleep disorders are not actually caused by some inherent sleep related issue. They're more caused by you losing out on sleep because you're just worried about some other external issue that's occurring in your life. Okay, someone could have a sleep issue if they have too much caffeine, for example, or they exercise too too close to their bedtime. So all of these could be secondary sleep disorders because they're actually not due to an inherent or like underlying actual sleep related issue. Okay, primary sleep disorders are actual sleep disorders that actually affect your sleep-wake cycle, and they're inherently due to some issue with your sleep-wake cycle being interrupted or disrupted or mismatched. Okay, so what's the main difference between sleep disturbance and sleep disorders? So as I mentioned before, sleep disorders are more intense in nature. They do involve more symptoms of sleep disturbance. Okay, so obviously, oops, sorry, did I do? Okay, let me just accept these people. Yeah, so sleep disorders are more intense in nature. So if you look at the word disorder, there's a lack of order there. There's a lack of functioning. There's some dysfunction. So they're obviously more intense in nature. But sleep disorders do actually incorporate a lot of the symptoms of a sleep disturbance. So they kind of like encapsulate that idea of sleep disturbance, but they are more intense in nature. Sleep disorders also lead to some dysfunction or impairment in your daily functioning. So for example, you lose out on your sleep so much if you have insomnia that you can't go to school. When you have insomnia, you feel so drained that you can't even go to work. Okay, it affects your daily functioning in terms of how you live your life. So that's basically the main difference between a sleep disturbance and a sleep disorder. Okay, so now we're looking at circadian rhythm phase disorders. Now, circadian rhythm phase disorders are a special type of sleep disorder that involve some kind of disruption or some kind of mismatch, some kind of inconsistency between the normal sleep-wake pattern that's expected of a person and then the actual sleep-wake pattern that they go through or that they basically demonstrate. So in other words, circadian rhythm phase disorders is when there's a mismatch between the actual expectation of, okay, as a teenager, you are expected to get 9 to 10 hours of sleep, for example, and the actual reality, which is that most teenagers only get about 4 or 5 hours of sleep, realistically. Okay, so circadian rhythm phase disorders is talking about the mismatch between these two. Okay, the expectation of what you guys are required to have, and then the reality of how much you actually end up having. Now, remember, circadian rhythm comes from the word circadian cycle, which means it's basically our body clock. Remember when in chapter 9, we looked at the fact that everyone's got a specific body clock that determines, okay, which time you go to sleep and which time you wake up. And it's very habitual in the sense that if you're always someone who falls asleep at 10 o'clock, you would not be able to really stay up past 12 o'clock. If you're someone that only goes to sleep every day at 1 a.m., it's going to be very difficult for you to go to sleep very early, like at 10 o'clock p.m. Okay, so that's essentially what circadian rhythm phase disorders are. And a circadian rhythm is obviously influenced by a lot of different things. It's not the same for everyone, and it's not the same for everyone at every part of their life. So depending on which stage of your life you're in, for example, with me, when I was in university, I could easily pull all-nighters all the time, stay up. And now I'm just like, I just cannot stay up past 1 a.m. Okay, so obviously it's different for everyone, and it's obviously a big impact. It's really highly impacted by lifestyle. So your lifestyle, the kind of factors that you engage in terms of your diet, in terms of your exercise, in terms of your stress levels, in terms of your general lifestyle, like do you have to work 9 to 5 or are you unemployed? All that kind of stuff can affect your body clock, which is essentially our circadian rhythm. Okay, now some examples of circadian rhythm phase disorders that we are going to go through today. This is just from the previous PowerPoint. Again, looking at the fact that the circadian rhythm describes the 24-hour cycle and essentially what happens at each of those points. Now, this is just a guide. Not all of your circadian cycles will be exactly the same. It depends again on which time you go to sleep and which time you wake up. That really influences at which time all of these things will happen. Now, again, you don't need to know this diagram. You don't need to memorize it. You don't need to know when, on average, when people have the best coordination. No, we're not going to test you on this. That would be way too complicated. You just need to understand that when melatonin secretion stops, basically when melatonin stops getting released in your body, that's when you will wake up from your sleep. Okay, and when melatonin starts to get released in the evening or during the nighttime, that's when you start to get a bit sleepy. So I'm kind of like really just focusing on these 2 points here. If I can just circle them. So just this one and then this one. Okay, these are the 2 most important points. So this is the point, oops, dropped my stylus. Okay, this is the point where you start to get a little bit like sleepy, and this is the point where you start to wake up. That should be an I, but it doesn't look like one. Okay, so yeah, that's basically the 2 most important things. So melatonin stops getting released, you wake up. Melatonin starts getting released, you go to sleep. And this is why there's a lot of tips around, you know, making sure you get exposure to proper light first thing in the morning, making sure you don't go on your phone before bedtime, because all of these things like artificial light, like blue light that comes from phones and devices, can actually stuff up the release of your melatonin. So your melatonin might not get released until very late into the nighttime, and that would lead to you staying up. We'll learn more about this when we do sleep hygiene education in the second half of this chapter. Alrighty. Okay, so the main specific, sorry, I'll just read this question. Does your melatonin levels decrease when you stay up longer? Your melatonin levels don't really decrease when you stay up longer, but they basically get used to a different schedule of how they get released. For example, in a normal person who might fall asleep at around, let's say, I don't know, like 10:30, 11, melatonin might start to get released about 9 o'clock. But obviously with teenagers, as we're going to learn about, their melatonin gets released a little bit later because they're going through puberty. And we're going to learn about this in the next few slides. If you make staying up a habit, like every night you're staying up until 1 or 2 a.m., eventually what happens is that your melatonin release is going to kind of get readjusted. So your melatonin is going to release later into the nighttime, and then it's not going to stop getting released until about, 11 or 12, 11 a.m. or something. And that's a problem, especially for teenagers, because you guys are falling asleep at 1 a.m., but your melatonin is still stopping its release at 7:30. So you're not really getting enough sleep, if that makes sense, because you just automatically wake up in the morning. So that's why it is important to make sure that you don't make staying up a habit, okay? But yeah, your melatonin levels themselves won't decrease. It's just the timing of the melatonin that changes if you stay up for a long period of time and you make that a habit. Okay, I'm just reading a question. It's in the same number of concentration. Okay, so with melatonin release, so when you take a nap in the afternoon, essentially what happens is that a nap might not necessarily, like, we don't take naps every day, and this is why your parents will probably be like, don't take naps during the afternoon. So the problem with taking a nap every day is that, yes, it can affect and it can kind of stuff up your release of melatonin. Melatonin is one of those things that is very easily affected, especially if you're doing something consistently, like staying up all the time or taking a nap every day at the same time. The problem with taking a nap every day at the same time is that your melatonin will start to get released a little bit earlier then. And that can then essentially make you fall asleep maybe a little bit earlier, but then wake up in the middle of the night and then toss and turn around in bed. So yeah, taking consistent naps every day in the afternoon is not a very good idea, because yeah, it can, but obviously, like, if you're taking a nap once in a while, it's not a big deal. It's not going to affect thing, but yeah, you shouldn't be taking naps every day in the afternoon. Again, it depends on the duration of your nap as well. Some people take like 20-minute power naps, and those are actually really effective. But if you're taking a nap that turns into like a 5-hour sleep, then that could be an issue. And as we learned about in chapter 8, a lot of the time when we are in an altered state, we can't really notice time going by. So it's very, at least with me, whenever I take a nap, it just turns into a sleep. So I don't even bother taking naps anymore. But yeah, if you're one of those very skilled people that can take naps for 20 minutes, then by all means, it's like pretty good. I've heard that it actually boosts your brain function and stuff. So that's really, yeah, that's a good idea. We are going through chapter 10, so not chapter 9. Okay, so sleep, circadian rhythm phase disorders. Yeah, so these are the three that we're going to look at today. I'm pretty sure you guys have heard about all of these. Maybe you haven't heard about the green one. We all know what jet lag is. We've probably experienced it ourselves at some point. Shift work, you might know people, you might have older siblings, for example. You might have parents who even, or uncles or aunts who work in occupations or industries where they have to work shifts, for example, with nursing. Okay, you have to work night shift. Okay, in certain companies, you might have to work the night shift. So essentially, that can really stuff up with your sleep-wake cycle as well, because you're working at a time when everyone else is asleep. The sleep-wake cycle shift in adolescence. A lot of people don't know about this, but this is the main reason that adolescents start to stay up. Adolescents start to not feel sleepy. Okay, if they were in primary school and they used to fall asleep at 8 o'clock, now they can't fall asleep until 11 or 12. Okay, and this is the kind of biological reasoning behind why it happens. And we're going to look at the psychological and social factors as well. So the sleep-wake cycle shift in adolescence, what does it mean? The sleep-wake cycle shift in adolescence is basically this idea, it's this circadian rhythm phase disorder that suggests that adolescents stay up and they don't feel asleep until very late into the night, because there's a natural hormonally induced shift which actually makes melatonin get released 2 hours later than what they had experienced in childhood. So when your melatonin is getting released 2 hours later, melatonin, that means you're going to essentially fall asleep 2 hours later as well. So let's just make, I'll just give you guys a clear example of what this means. So obviously, if your melatonin used to get released about, let's say, 7 o'clock when you're in like grade 6, and then you fall asleep at about 9 o'clock in the nighttime. Okay, that's obviously normal for that age. But once you've reached adolescence, once you've passed puberty, there are certain hormones that are released during puberty, like, for example, the growth hormone, which actually affect what time melatonin is released. So for you guys now, melatonin might be released only at about 10 o'clock, which is much later than what it had been released in childhood. And so that means that you're only going to feel asleep about 1 to 2 hours after that. So probably you might only feel sleepy at 12 o'clock. Okay, no matter how hard you try to go to sleep at 10 o'clock or at 9 o'clock, you can't fall asleep because your brain is just not ready. The melatonin hasn't been released. Okay, now the problem with the sleep-wake cycle shift is, yeah, if adolescents didn't have anything better to do with their lives and they were just at home all the time, it wouldn't be a problem if they slept later. But the problem is that we're still getting adolescents to wake up at the same time every morning for school, not acknowledging the fact that the sleep-wake cycle shift has actually made them fall asleep later. And it's not always their fault. Of course, certain things that teenagers do can exacerbate the situation or make it worse. But we have to understand that this is a biological factor that influences why adolescents fall asleep later. Okay, and there's been a lot of all these debates around schools should start later for high school students is actually kind of rooted in this particular concept that adolescents, melatonin is released about 2 hours later than children, and so they end up sleeping later and end up waking up later. Okay, so essentially that's what the sleep-wake cycle shift is about. Now, what the implication of this is that when the adolescent's onset of sleep, which is the time they fall asleep, is shifted forward, which means that it's obviously going to be later in the nighttime, they fall asleep later in the night compared to earlier sleeping patterns they might have had in childhood. Okay, so if you look at your younger siblings and you're like, they're so lucky, they can actually fall asleep by 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock and I'm just stuck here until 1 a.m. Well, this is one of the biological reasons why that happens. Okay, and obviously the biopsychosocial framework is something we always try to apply to everything. So it's good to apply that to this topic as well. So obviously I always talk about melatonin. So melatonin is the sleep hormone, okay? In the same way cortisol is a stress hormone, melatonin is your primary sleep hormone. Now, melatonin doesn't just work by itself. It is dependent on factors. And like I said before, the release of melatonin is a very kind of funny little thing where it is actually influenced by a lot of other factors and can be easily disrupted. So how much natural sunlight you're exposed to first thing in the morning, how much screen time you have, how much caffeine you're consuming, how much exercise you get right before bedtime. All of these things can influence the release of melatonin. Psychological and social factors can also impact your sleep cycles. Not so much impact the release of melatonin itself, but I guess it can impact your actual sleep cycle and how quickly you fall asleep. So if you've got mental health issues like stress or anxiety, these can obviously lead to, lead to problems with sleep-wake cycle, and it can exacerbate that sleep-wake cycle shift that we talked about before. So this is P, so that's psychological factor. Overthinking is another psychological factor because it's relating to your thoughts. Heavy school workloads is more of a social factor because your school is a social environment. Working in a part-time job, again, is employment, so that's social, that's an S. Problems with friends is your relationship, so that's an S. The need to socially network late into night, and gaming, so both of these are also social factors, okay? So if I ever ask you in a SAC or quiz situation, identify one psychological factor contributing to a sleep-wake cycle shift, you might talk about overthinking, anything related to your thoughts and feelings. When we're talking about social factors, it's anything related to the social environment. That could be, having a fight with a friend, feeling the need to socially network late into the night and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's basically applying the bio. So this is the B. This is the biological factor, and the psychological factor is in the pink box, and the social factors are in the pink box as well. Alrighty. Okay, just a question. How does melatonin tablet affect the body compared to normal melatonin? Does it help a person fall asleep? Tablets. The melatonin tablet, I've seen that as well. It's in the chemists and stuff. There's not a lot of again, it can work differently across different people. Again, the melatonin tablet is no replacement for natural release of melatonin, because again, the tablet is just a synthetic version of melatonin. It's not like the real hormone that's released in the body. So the best thing to do would be to probably try to like enhance the natural release of melatonin by getting that natural sunlight, by sticking to a sleep schedule, by avoiding too much caffeine before bedtime, by putting a blue light filter on all your devices, and altogether just stopping your device usage before bedtime. Because again, there's not much evidence backing up melatonin supplements. Some people it works really well, but for some people it doesn't work much at all. And there are differences. Again, different people respond to medication differently because of genetic factors, because of the way their bodies work, because of certain reactions they might have. So it's always better to stick to the natural melatonin. But melatonin supplementation or tablets are actually given to people with insomnia in conjunction to other therapies. So I'm not going to say that it's completely crap. It does have some validity, but again, it really depends. It works differently for different people. Okay, so jet lag is the second circadian rhythm phase disorder we're going through. So jet lag is a sleep disorder that is caused from some kind of a sleep disturbance when you're traveling across multiple time zones. And so if you guys have gone overseas, especially to countries that have very different time zones. So the further you travel, the more likely you will have jet lag. If you travel to a very close by country, like, I don't know, New Zealand or something, like a country that's really close by to us, you probably wouldn't have as much jet lag as if you had traveled to, let's say, America or like a country on the other side of the world. So essentially, brought on by rapid travel across multiple time zones. What do we mean by rapid travel? Well, back in the olden days when we didn't have planes, people used to travel from place to place by ship. So, back then travel was a lot more slow, and people's bodies could actually adjust to this traveling across multiple time zones. Today, I could literally I couldn't hop on a plane today because we have coronavirus, but like, let's say like this time last year, I could have hopped onto a plane and I could have traveled to the other side of the world in less than 24 hours. And because your circadian rhythm is 24 hours, that doesn't give your body enough time to adjust to that different time zones. So your body might still be in Melbourne time zone when you're in Los Angeles in America, or when you're in London. Okay, so essentially your body is still stuck in the old time zone, but then it has to be forced into adapting to the new time zone because, you know, the time that you'd normally fall asleep in Melbourne is now the time that you've got your tour around, I don't know, Hollywood or something when you go to America. So you have to force yourself to be awake for those things. Now, jet lag obviously is not a permanent thing. People usually
I'm so scared right
after
now.
they come back.
Bro, I think I pissed my...
People usually get over jet lag after they've come back from their particular country that they've visited. It can take a few days, but there are certain symptoms that we all probably have experienced if you've ever had jet lag. So we'll just go through some of those symptoms. And again, if I ever ask you to justify why jet lag is an example of a circadian rhythm phase disorder, you would essentially say that it's an example of a circadian rhythm phase disorder because it demonstrates a mismatch, some kind of inconsistency between our internal body clock and the external environment. So again, the expectations versus the reality explanation. So your body expects that it is Melbourne time zone, but the reality is that you're in LA, in America. Okay, and so your body kind of has to force yourself to adjust to that new time zone. Well, when internally it's not ready, the body's not prepared to deal with that right at that point in time. Alrighty, so symptoms of jet lag. So we use a memory tip called Flipped to remember this, and you can remember the memory tip by thinking about the fact that when you move to a new country, when you go to a new country, the first few days, or when you come back from a new country, back to Melbourne, for example, the first few days, it feels like your body and brain are flipped, okay? Like your whole functioning is like really strange, like you don't feel yourself in the way that you would normally, function. So obviously the first one is F. So F for feeling unwell. A lot of people have like digestive issues. They feel like they can't, like if they eat something, they feel like, oh, I feel like blah, it doesn't feel good. A general feeling of being unwell, essentially. L is for low levels of daytime alertness. So essentially what that means is that you might be in, you might be in school the next day after coming back from overseas, but you can't stay alert. You just feel like drowsy and groggy and you don't feel mentally there. I is for impaired concentration and cognitive ability, which means that you're not able to concentrate, you're not able to think straight, you're not able to reason, you're not able to make decisions properly there. P is for problems with falling asleep and waking up. So essentially this is what we call problems with the sleep-wake cycle, okay? So remember I said before, this idea of falling asleep and waking up is what we refer to as our sleep-wake cycle. So you are going to have problems with the sleep-wake cycle when you have jet lag. And again, like you might have noticed when you've come back from a holiday, normally you'd never wake up at 5 a.m. in the morning, or 6 a.m. in the morning, unless you really, really, obviously unless you had to pray, but you would never really stay up. But, you're like staying up the whole day from like 5 a.m. You're not going back to sleep. And it's just like, that's because there's an issue with your sleep-wake cycle. And the D is for discomfort. So obviously discomfort within the body from sleep-wake cycle disruption. So this is kind of that blah feeling that we all get when we have jet lag. It's like, oh, I feel so disgusting, blah, blah, blah. So that's called, the fancy way of saying blah, blah is malaise. Okay, so malaise is the general feeling of discomfort and that kind of like basically unpleasant feeling that you have. Okay, so that's essentially some symptoms or some effects of jet lag. So maybe just learn at least 2 or 3 from this list here. And it's all common sense at the end of the day. You just have to think about when was the last time you had jet lag and what did you experience or feel? None of this is like word to word essentially. Okay, and the last one we're looking at is shift work. So sleep-wake cycle disruption due to shift work. Now, shift work is obviously work that happens on a schedule that is outside the usual 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. working day. Okay, and people who work in shift work kind of careers or who work shifts generally work at times when most people would be asleep. So you're asleep in your bed at 3 a.m. and someone is literally working the peak hour at the hospital in the hospital ward, okay? Nurses often do this, midwives often do shift work. sometimes certain surgeons as well. So usually anyone who works in a kind of industry that kind of operates almost all the time or has to operate all the time would usually work shifts. Okay. Or even like, you know, even bakeries, like a lot of you might not know, but like the main kind of people who like chefs or whoever like that go to bake bread and donuts and all that stuff in your favorite bakeries, like they have to actually get to the bakery by like 2 or 3 a.m. usually, because it obviously takes a long time. So again, shift work is any work that happens outside the normal working hours. Now people who do shift work, they tend to disrupt their sleep-wake cycle because the body's not actually biologically programmed to stay awake well into the late hours of the night. And you would remember that when we did our theories of sleep in the last chapter, in chapter 9, we looked at 2 theories of sleep. The first one was called the restoration theory of sleep, and the second one was called the evolutionary. And I've called it survival in this slide, but survival is old terminology, so I'm just going to write the correct one here. Again, if you're doing a past study design exam and you come across the word survival theory of sleep, the survival theory of sleep is essentially the evolutionary theory of sleep. They're the same thing, but just different names. So the evolutionary theory of sleep basically provides evidence for this idea that people are not biologically programmed to stay awake well into the late hours of the night. Okay, so essentially shift work is necessary, but it's not ideal. But essentially how all of these industries operate is that there needs to be people who can work shifts. We can't just have robots doing it for them. Okay, so sleep disruptions from shift work can lead to decreased judgment. And this is a really big problem because if we're having nurses who are dealing with patients every day or surgeons who are doing surgeries that could essentially harm a person or that could essentially save a person's life, if they're not having proper judgment and they make a poor judgment call, that could actually lead to someone being really harmed or even like, dying essentially, especially if you're working in healthcare. So decreased judgment is a problem. And so this is why there's a lot of strict laws and regulations around, especially with people like nurses and surgeons, around making sure that the shift work is reasonable, not overloading a person with shift work. So if you've ever got spoken to someone who's a nurse, or you've got someone like an older sibling or a friend who is a nurse or a midwife, you might realize that a lot of the time they don't have shift work all the time. They've only got their night shift for like a specific part of their roster. Okay, you can't have someone working shift work for 365 days of the year. Okay, it just doesn't make sense, and it would eventually kill that person. It's not good. Poor decision making increases the risk of errors or accidents. So again, making sure that we can understand that when you are working, a lot of us can barely think straight waking up at 7 a.m. in the morning for work or for school. So you can only imagine someone that's staying up, having to work at like 3 or 2 a.m. in the morning, the kind of little mistakes and things that they would make. So again, just understanding that from a common sense point of view. Okay, I think, that's all we were going to go through for today. Tomorrow we'll be starting sleep deprivation. Okay, so essentially that's all for today. Now I just wanted to share the screen, so I'll just stop the recording here first.